Hi, I'm Ken from the KMRwoodshop. I'm going to make some clappers and show you how it's done. My raw material is 2-inch thick hard maple, which I get from a local supplier. But as you can see, it's not always perfect on both sides, so the first step is to run it through the surface planer to clean that up. As you can see, the edges of the board are not much better than the surface, so the next step is to clean up one edge on the jointer. Now I can cut the piece to length, putting the cleaned up edge next to the fence on the saw to keep the cut square. I have one edge of the board cleaned up on the jointer. Now I'm going to clean up the opposite edge on the table saw. I want the clappers to be 3 inches wide on one end and 2.5 inches wide on the other end, so I set up my tapering jig to make this cut. Because one edge of the remaining piece is already tapered to the right angle, all I need to do is cut it to the right width. Now at the router table, I'll cut grooves 1/2 inch in from each edge for the epoxy inlays. I run it through 2 times on each edge just to make sure that the cut is clean. I've mixed the epoxy with some red dye and some glitter in a process that's very mundane, so I'm not going to bore you with it. But now it's time to put this epoxy into the grooves that I just finished routing in the clappers. The torch heats up the epoxy, which pops all the little bubbles that form when it's stirred. It also makes the epoxy flow more easily so I can even it out. Now the epoxy has to cure for 24 hours. Now I round over the ends of the clappers on the bandsaw. The bandsaw gets rid of most of the waste quickly, but it leaves a rough cut, so I'm going to smooth that off on the sander. I start with an 80 grit belt and move all the way up through these belts to 600 grit to get a very smooth finish. And with the finer grit belts, I do the top and bottom and the edges all the way around to make sure everything is nice and smooth. Now it's back to the router table for 2 more steps. The first one is to round over the corners of the clappers to get rid of that sharp edge. And the next step is to route the grooves down each side. The edges of these grooves end up being sharp, so I hand sand them to take that sharpness off and make it more comfortable to hold. The final step is to sand them to what one customer called an insane smoothness. I start with an 800 grit disc, since everything had already been sanded to 600 grit. And as you can see, I go all the way down to a 10,000 grit disc. And there you have it. New clappers ready to make some quilter happy.